Hello, in this week's lecture we want to take a look at some issues involving inflation and deflation. These are discussed in the textbook in chapter 6. So we want to explore what happens when we have the macro problems of either inflation or deflation. First of all, it's important to look at some characteristics of both, because there are a lot of misnomers about what inflation entails and also what deflation entails. So I want to try and express some characteristics of each. Starting with inflation. Inflation is where prices on average rise. So inflation does not mean every price goes up. By saying on average, it means that more prices go up than go down or stay the same. So prices on average rise. In the United States, we have inflationary concerns. It typically originates from excessive growth. So when our economy is growing very fast, that is faster than or real GDP is growing by more than 3 to 4% per year, that's considered excessive. And so excessive growth will tend to cause inflationary pressure. Now, the main problem with inflation is that it results in the loss of what's called purchasing power. And purchasing power is the ability of your income to acquire goods and services. So if prices are going up on average and your income isn't rising as fast, then you lose purchasing power. It becomes more expensive to buy goods and services, and so your money has less purchasing power. It has the power to buy less goods and services. So the main problem with inflation is that it results in a loss of purchasing power. Now in this chapter, I'm going to have a very clear bias towards inflation, because in the United States it's typically our concern. Our economy is typically growing, and because of that growth, we have to always be aware of inflationary tendencies. I will mention deflation, and we'll look at how to calculate that as well. Inflation is where prices on average fall. So deflation is where prices on average fall. It's rare in the United States because, as I just mentioned, our economy is typically in growth mode. Our economy is typically growing, and because of this growth, we typically don't have deflationary concerns. When you have deflation, it's the result of recessionary conditions, and because we rarely have recessions in the United States, it tends to be less of a concern. But when you do have severe recessionary conditions, you can see that the pressure on prices on average is falling. Now, I'm going to focus on 4 types of inflation. The first one is known as demand pull inflation, and demand pull inflation is where you have an increase in demand for goods and services throughout the economy, and that increased demand for goods and services pulls up prices. So if you can imagine taking an individual market, for example, when there's an increase in demand in that market, the demand curve shifts to the right. And as it shifts to the right, the equilibrium price is pulled higher. So if you can imagine, in most markets throughout the economy, demand curves are shifting to the right, pulling up the prices in those respective markets. Then on average, prices would be higher, and it would cause demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is the most common type of inflation in the United States, because our economy is typically growing and people have demand for more and more goods and services, and that tends to drive up prices. So demand pull is the most common in the United States. Another type of inflation that we on occasions will sometimes detect is called cost push inflation. And cost push inflation is going to originate from the supply side. It's where the cost of resources go up throughout the economy, and that tends to cause prices to rise. If you can imagine an individual market where you have an increase in the cost of resources in that market, as the costs go up, the supply curve will shift to the left. And as it shifts to the left, the equilibrium price will be pushed higher. So cost push inflation is where you have an increase in cost of resources throughout the entire economy, and that pushes supply curves in respective markets to the left. Prices in those markets rise, and the average rise in prices leads to cost push inflation. So demand pull is coming from the demand side, cost push is coming from the supply side. The absolute worst type of inflation, which we don't have in the United States, is called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is super ruinous when it comes to the health of the economy. Hyperinflation is where prices rise by at least 50% per month. So it's kind of a minimum definition of hyperinflation. It's where prices rise by at least 50% per month. And that is just unconscionable, the devastation such price increases will cause under conditions of hyperinflation. For example, if something costs $1 on January 1st of a particular year, and it's subject to minimum hyperinflation, which is a 50% increase per month, at the end of a 12-month period, that product, which cost $1 on January 1st of the previous year, would cost about $130, $132 on January of the next year. So hyperinflation results in prices increasing at a hyper rate, and it's just devastating to the economy. Purchasing power basically vanishes because prices are rising so much faster than income. Another type of inflation is called core inflation, and core inflation is where you estimate inflation, as we'll talk about doing. It's where you estimate inflation, but you exclude food and energy prices from the estimate. So you look at the behavior of all prices on average, but you ignore food and energy prices. So you're basically stripping out food and energy prices from the estimate. And by stripping out those food and energy prices, the remaining prices behavior is called core inflation. And we'll look at how that's calculated. In terms of how to measure inflation, and we'll focus primarily at the household level, measuring inflation that you and I as consumers would typically encounter. This is done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Each month they track prices, and what they do is they choose a sample of some prices of different goods and services that consumers would buy, and they track those prices from month to month. Now, this sampling, they sometimes refer to it as a market basket, where they look at a market basket of goods that a typical consumer would purchase, and they just track those prices from month to month, and based on the price movements of those products in the market basket, that gives them a good idea of the extent of inflation in the economy. Now, again, I'm focusing strictly on the inflation that would be detectable at the household level. The Bureau of Labor Statistics also has ways of detecting inflation at many different levels. Wholesale, by particular products, so many different approaches they use to try and identify and isolate inflationary pressure. Now, in terms of how they do this, they have to develop something called the Consumer Price Index. And the Consumer Price Index is a way of tracking how prices move from one period to the next, typically a month, how prices move from month to month, but the price movements are expressed with respect to some base period. So you look at how prices are changing relative to a base period or a base month. So let's look at a simple example. So I have here a column on months. So we're going to play this exercise over a 4-month period. And during this 4-month period, we're looking at our market basket. Again, the market basket has a sampling of goods in there and services, and we're tracking their price. Now let's say, for example, each month we look at our market basket and we come up with an average price. The average price simplistically would be taking all the prices for all the products in the market basket, adding them up, and dividing by the number of prices. So you get like a simple average. The Bureau uses a more complicated approach, but for our purposes, we'll just assume a simple average. So the average price in that market basket was $5 for the first month. Then it jumps to $5.50 for the second month, $6 for the third month, and $7 for the fourth month. All right. Now in this example, I'm going to choose month 3 as my base month. So all of my interpretations of price movements will be with respect to month 3, which is my base. And so to calculate the CPI, just like in a similar manner in which you calculate the GDP deflator, you take the average sample price for each month and divide it by the base month average sample price. So for month 1, I take the average price of $5 divided by the base month average price, which is $6, and I get a CPI value of 0.833. If I move that decimal place 2 places to the right, I would end up with 83.3 basis points. So CPIs and most indexes are usually expressed in basis point format, and all you're doing is moving the decimal place 2 places to the right. And so I calculated the respective CPIs for each month in this exercise, and if you notice, for the base month, the CPI value is 100 basis points, and it makes sense because when you divide the base month's prices by its own prices, you will get an index value of 1 or 100 basis points. Now the way you interpret the CPIs, again, they're interpreted with respect to the base. For example, for month 4, where the CPI was 117 basis points, that means that prices in month 4 were 17% higher than they were for the base. So if you take 117 minus 100, and that difference will give you how much prices differ from the base period in percentage terms. So for month 4, the prices for month 4 were 17% higher. For month 2, the CPI was 91.7, and that means that prices for month 2 were about 8.3% lower than they were for the base. So if you take 100 minus 97, you would get a difference there of about 8.3%, and so it means that prices for the second month were about 8.3% lower than the base. Right? Or another way of thinking of it, if something cost $100 in month 3, you could have got it for $91.70 in month 2. All right. So the CPIs are telling us how prices are changing with respect to the base month. Now once I've calculated those CPIs, then I can use them to detect inflation or deflation. And just to illustrate this, I want to use some actual BLS data, and this data is coming from the statistical abstract, which is a nice one-stop shopping for all types of data sources. And the way you can calculate the inflation rate or deflation rate is you would take CPIs for the period you're studying, and you express the CPI differences in percentage terms. And there's a little formula that says take CPI 1 minus CPI 0 and then divide that by CPI 0 and multiply it times 100. And by doing that, if that percent change is positive, that's the inflation rate. If the percent change is negative, that's the deflation rate. If the percentage change is 0, which is what we ideally want, then that suggests price stability. So our goal for the economy is to have prices relatively stable, to have the percent change as close to 0 as possible. Now, in doing the designation of CPI 1 and CPI 0, for the period you're studying, whatever CPI is the most forward in time, that period CPI will be CPI 1. For example, if I'm studying, inflation between 2000 and 2001, 2001 is the most forward in time, so CPI for 2001 be designated as CPI 1. And of course, CPI 0 would be by default for 2000. So whatever period is the most forward in time, its CPI will be assigned to CPI 1. And then you just plug the numbers into the formula, crank out the result, and then interpret the result as we just indicated. To illustrate this, I use some actual BLS data, and this data is on an annual basis where they calculate the CPIs for each year. And let's look, for example, at 2007, 2008. So for this time period, 2008 would be I would assign its CPI to CPI 1 because 2008 is the most forward in time. And it turns out that the CPI for 2008 was 215.3 basis points. And so for 2008, its CPI would be CPI 1. 2007, its CPI was 207.3 basis points, and so its CPI I would designate as CPI 0. Now these CPIs, their values are interpreted with respect to the base, and the base that the Bureau used for this exhibit, you notice here at the bottom of the table, the base period was 1982 through 84. So these CPIs should be interpreted as how prices have changed with respect to the 82-84 time period. So in other words, in 2008, prices were 115.3% higher on average than they were during the 1982 through 84 period. And so when you plug in these CPIs in the formula for 2007, 2008, I get a plus 3.8% change. And since the change is positive, that means that's the inflation rate. So between 2007 and 2008, prices rose on average by 3.8%. And I did the same thing for 2008, 2009. I took the respective CPIs. Now 2008, 2009, our economy was gripped by the Great Recession. And during the recession, prices actually fell, as we had asserted earlier, and prices fell on average by 0.4%. So for 2008, 2009, we actually had a deflation rate of 0.4%. And then by next year, we started to climb out of the, slowly started to climb out of the recessionary conditions, and the inflation rate started to increase again as the economy grew from 2009 to 2010. Okay. Now, when it comes to inflation, because it takes purchasing power, it tends to create winners and losers. For example, you can win during periods of inflation, win in the sense of preserving your purchasing power, if you can flex your income. So flexible income earners sometimes can win during periods of inflation. That is, if prices are going up by, say, I don't know, 2%, and a person can supplement their income through maybe part-time work or getting overtime, and the supplemental income results in their income going up by more than 2%, then they're beating inflation. They're winning the inflation game. Debtors can also win when it comes to inflation, because when you have debt obligations, your payment responsibilities are typically fixed. And so if you're paying a consistent amount back and prices rise, then the money you're paying back has less purchasing power. So in fact, you're having to give up less income. I mean, the dollars you're paying back have less purchasing power. And so in effect, you are technically saving income, so you're winning in response to the inflation. Now, there are also clearly losers when it comes to inflation. For example, those persons who are on fixed income, their income is fixed, prices rise. As prices rise, it tends to dilute their purchasing power, and so they lose. Savers, you put money in an account during periods of inflation. Savers can lose in the sense that their money is sitting idle in a savings account earning a fixed interest rate. If prices rise, then their effective returns they're getting on their savings tends to drop. Creditors also lose because the debtors are paying them back with dollars that have less purchasing power, and so the creditors are receiving income that has been to some degree stripped of some of its purchasing power capabilities. So inflation does tend to redistribute the benefits, economic benefits, because winners can gain advantages because of inflation, and losers, of course, lose purchasing power as a result. Now, in terms of other topics involving inflation, it's important to distinguish between what is known as real income and nominal income, and this is in the same spirit as distinguishing between real GDP and nominal GDP. Real income can be thought of as income that has been corrected for the effects of inflation. So real income tells you your real purchasing power, and so you've accounted for the influences of inflation. Nominal income is going to be income that doesn't reflect or doesn't account for the effects of inflation. And the way you would calculate real income, you would simply take nominal income and divide it by an index such as the CPI. So real income equals nominal income divided by the CPI. And by dividing the nominal income by the CPI, you're correcting the income to account for inflation. So you get a real income measure. Alright, there are many techniques in our economy that are designed to protect different groups against inflation. So we're going to look at a couple ways to hedge or protect against inflation. One way to do that, one very common way, is to use something called a COLA. And a COLA stands for a cost of living adjustment. And this cost of living adjustment simply is an income supplement given to the recipient of the COLA. And the objective of the income supplement is to offset inflation. For example, if prices are rising by 3%, if your income doesn't increase by at least 3%, you're going to lose purchasing power. Now, if you get a COLA that gives you a 3% income supplement, then you've neutralized the effects of inflation. So if prices go up 3% and your income through the COLA goes up 3%, then you don't lose purchasing power. So the COLA is designed to kind of protect income from loss of purchasing power. And those persons on like fixed income that we alluded to earlier, one of the ways their vulnerability is reduced is that their fixed income gets linked to a COLA. And so as prices rise, their income will be adjusted upward and their purchasing power is preserved. Another very common technique for protecting against inflation is known as the banker's adjustment, banker's interest rate adjustment. And this is where lenders, such as banks, will pad the interest rate they charge customers. And in the process of padding the interest rate, they build into the interest rate a component designed to protect them from loss of purchasing power. And that component is known as the inflation premium. And so within the interest rate you're being charged, there is a component in that interest rate called the inflation premium. And what it's doing is acting just like a COLA. For example, say I go to a bank and I want to borrow some money, and the bank will charge me a certain interest rate. So they'll charge me 7% interest rate for the loan. And within that 7% they're charging me, there's a component in that interest rate that's giving the bank compensation for any loss of purchasing power they may experience when I start to pay them the loan back. Say, for example, I want a 2-year loan. So the bank then estimates that during that 2-year period, the prices are going to rise by 2%. Okay, so within the interest rate they're going to charge me, they're going to build in a 2% buffer, this 2% inflation premium, and the premium will protect them against loss of purchasing power when I start paying them back. So I start making payments back to them. The payments I'm giving them will include a component that was designated to offset inflationary pressure. So the banker's interest rate adjustment is just one technique that's used to protect, in this case, lenders against loss of purchasing power, right? And so in the text there's discussion of, the nominal interest rate, the real interest rate, and the inflation premium. Please read that discussion, but note that the banker's adjustment is really coming through the inflationary premium component. Okay. All right. So that concludes an overview of the main topics of inflation and deflation discussed in the textbook. Please take a look at these concepts and work through the designated homework. It'll help you to become very comfortable with this material. It's really just a question of knowing what to focus on, what to calculate, and how to interpret it. And with practice, it becomes pretty easy. Alright, so that concludes this lecture, and take care and study hard.